about this question. How well do you know the students at your schools? And when I say how well, I don't mean like what they do for summer vacation, who they're dating, but do you know if they have anxiety or depression? Do you know if they were diagnosed as gifted when they were younger but didn't ever get services? Do you know if they have ADHD? So think about how well you know your students. I want you to think about that for about 20 seconds and then turn to an elbow partner and share. Go.
The students who are attending your school. We want to get a sense of who's in the room here. So could you just put your hand up if you're a counselor? Please, we have a few counselors. School leaders. Great. Teachers. Okay, and if there's anything I didn't say?
I'm a special educator.
You're a special educators. Okay.
Different from teaching.
Okay. Yes. All right. Thank you for that.
So in your roles, you guys are often the ones who can kind of be the connector. I think all of our students really need teams behind them, but students with exceptionalities especially do. They need their parents, their teachers, their counselors, their outside therapists to come together, and often that is the role of the school leaders to make sure systems are in place. Of the teacher, a special educator, we often find ourselves in that role. Counselors are definitely you guys are here for our presentation because we really see you as the leaders of building those support systems and those support teams for these students.
So they want us to use this mic, but I'm hoping my voice is really loud. Okay, mics. Let's talk about the goals that we hope to accomplish today. We want to make sure that we're identifying those academic needs of our students with exceptionalities, and also the social and emotional needs that we often don't quite focus on, right? And then thinking about, does that lead into sometimes a different pathway for students? And finally, we want to make sure we're reviewing the roles and the responsibilities, and Lindsey mentioned a bunch of different people, but basically of counselors, of educators, school leaders, and students as self-advocates.
All right, so let's get into it. I think that we're probably all coming to this with different levels of understanding about these different exceptionalities. So I want to get us all on the same page. We're going to talk about three major disability categories that we're likely to see in our schools and in our classrooms. And so the first one I want to talk about are students with specific learning disabilities. Specific learning disabilities, for a long time we used a discrepancy model to determine who these students are. That's no longer best practice in identifying, but I think it's still important in understanding. So students with specific learning disabilities have average to above average intelligence, which means we should expect them to do well in school. And so often we start to think of that they might have some sort of a specific learning disability when they are not achieving as we might expect, right? This is clearly a why are they doing so poorly in their classes? And for that reason, I don't know, I often hear people talk about specific learning disabilities. For a long time, a lot of these students are labeled as stupid, lazy, and dumb. Because everybody's like, you're a smart kid, I don't understand why you can't do this. And one of the reasons that these students often struggle is because they have very specific skill deficits. Usually, they are in the areas of reading, writing, and or math. Some of our students only struggle with one of those. Some students with SLD struggle with all three of them. It depends on where these specific learning disabilities are actual brain-based neurological differences. So it all depends on where those differences are. But I think it's important to know and to expect that students who struggle with reading are also probably going to struggle with writing, but not necessarily vice versa. So usually there's very specific skill deficits. Students with specific learning disabilities, sometimes because of those skill deficits, but sometimes for other reasons, also really struggle with information processing. So if I ask you a question like, who is the president, or who is the Prime Minister of India? Students with specific learning disabilities have to go, who? Okay, they're looking for a person. Is the president, okay, or Prime Minister. Prime Minister is the head of a country. India is where I live. Oh, I know, it's Modi. And so they have to go through all of those steps, whereas everybody else in the room, that just happens automatically. And so a lot of times our classes, they move too quickly for them. They are still thinking of the first answer that we asked after that answer has been answered and I've already launched into new information. It can also lead to some real problems with following directions. So these are students who often get in trouble for doing the wrong thing in class, but then act like, I don't understand why I did the wrong thing. It's because they really don't they didn't process those instructions in the same way as everybody else. So they really aren't trying to be difficult or bad, they just didn't understand. We went too quickly for them. And then often there comes difficulty with emotional regulation. I think for students with specific learning disabilities, again, they have average to above average intelligence. They know that they are struggling in ways that their peers do not. Everybody looks at them and thinks that they are screwing up. And so with that comes issues of learned helplessness is a huge thing, where students know that school has just always been a struggle, and they also know they've gotten used to people coming and bailing them out when things get hard, and so they just then sit there and like, it's not worth me trying because I'm not going to be able to, somebody's going to come and help me do it, so I'll just chill out and wait for somebody to come help. Often when things get hard, students with specific learning disabilities, they have low frustration tolerance, so they're really quick to just sort of give up. Sometimes it feels better to be bad or to be silly or to be aggressive than it does to feel dumb. And so these students, when it's time to do academic things that they're not good at, they might become aggressive, they might argue back, they might start to tell jokes and kind of mess around in class, but it's because they would rather be seen as bad than be seen as stupid. So now I'm going to pass this over to Bindiya to talk about some other.
So I'm going to talk about ADHD, which has two types. One is
hyperactive and the other is inattentive. So these are students who have trouble staying focused in class and engaged. And it could be because of either reason. You'll notice that some students seem to be looking at the teacher, but when you call on them, their mind's drifted somewhere else. Those are typically inattentive students. And it's not that they're not thinking, but they're not thinking about what you're saying. So the idea is to keep them engaged in the classroom, right? Students with ADHD hyperactive type are always on the move, and they're sort of in a rush to do things because their brains are moving way faster than any of their hand, like their hand is. So they're thinking ahead, and their hands can't keep up with what they're writing. So they also need to move around a lot. So what this results in is they're making lots of careless mistakes. They've already jumped on because they can perceive your question 3 questions ahead, and they're answering that question. The struggle for teachers is to keep them engaged in what you're doing and to keep them active so that they have to be present in the room. They have difficulty with organization, so they're not self-aware about time, and they think that things are going to take quick, and then it takes them much longer to do it. They have trouble organizing their materials. The pieces are all over the place. They're the ones who forget to bring things to school for PE when they need their backpacks. And it's not that they don't have the intention to do it, but they tend to do things really quickly. Or they're not focused on the task when they're doing the task, so they forget. And as I said, they need to move constantly because they have a lot of energy. Because they know the answers to questions sometimes, they tend to interrupt other people talking. And again, not with bad intention, but their mouth is, saying things before they can control themselves to stop. And then the students who don't seem to be paying attention, so part of them are focused on what the teacher is saying. So actually, you might call on a student because you think they're talking to someone else, but when you call on them, they have the right answer because their brain's engaged, in multi-directions. So they can be focused on what you're saying and something else at the same time. Right? Then you have students who are on the autism spectrum. And again, this is a spectrum. So with autism, the key indicators of autism are underdevelopment of social communication and cues, underdevelopment of communicating with their language is sometimes limited, and sometimes they have involuntary body movements. So this is known as stimming. You'll see them doing something with their hands. Again, this is caused by overstimulation or understimulation, and it's a way of them trying to self-regulate. Often, students on the autism spectrum learn how to respond. So they learn to say, hi, how are you? What's your name? My name is so-and-so, right? But then when you put them in a different situation, they can't always repeat that skill. So you might teach them ways of engaging in a classroom, but then you move them to another classroom, and the setup's different, and they can't repeat the skill somewhere else. Students on the autism spectrum really prefer environments that are structured, because what happens then is they know what they need to do next. If they don't know what they need to do next, it's very unsettling for them.
So we want to take a little bit of time thinking about the impact of these different disabilities. And I'm guessing, having heard a little bit about them, being refreshed of what some of these are, you have some ideas about what these impacts might be. So I'm actually going to invite you to turn to somebody near you. I feel like we've been talking for a long time. So turn to somebody near you and talk about what do you anticipate or what have you experienced when it comes to the impacts of these disabilities in the classroom. Let's just do all of them. When they are working independently and social emotionally, and then we'll talk about our ideas. So turn to somebody near you and have that conversation.
No, that was perfect because that was like a lot of information to digest. Yeah. You do.
30 more seconds. All right, let's come back together. Finish up your sentences. All right, so let's come back together. I heard some good things going on in those conversations. So just really briefly, some things that we want you to think about. I think when we were going through those characteristics, some things probably became a little bit clear. So I want to highlight some things that might not be so clear based on those characteristics. I think when we're thinking about the classroom, participation levels can actually be really affected by these disabilities on both ends of the spectrum, right? We have students who maybe are on the spectrum, who have ASD, who are not at all interested in participating with whatever is happening in the classroom because they don't have those social skills. We have students with specific learning disabilities who maybe don't want to because they don't want to take the risk and maybe be wrong and have everybody see that they were wrong. To the other end of the spectrum, where sometimes our students with attentional difficulties over participate, and it's the person that everybody is like, oh, I wish she would just stop talking. And so we see those issues with participation. We see similar issues with group work. When collaboration is a huge thing that we are encouraging in schools now, it can actually be really difficult for students who have these disabilities, and it can be really difficult for their peers to manage that as well. So that's something that we need to be thinking about and teaching explicitly. When it comes to independent work time, I think that students with these disabilities, they're the ones that sometimes really drive the teachers crazy, right? I told them to do something. I gave them all this time to do it. I don't understand why they're not doing it. And so helping teachers to understand reasons why students might not be initiating tasks, helping everybody to understand that if we just give somebody a long-term project, this is all about getting ready for college and careers. So again, we're often giving these longer-term tasks that we need to be specifically supporting the executive functioning skills of students with these disabilities. We need to help them with the goal setting. We need to help them learn how to make plans. We need to help them think about and have realistic expectations for themselves when it comes to these plans. A lot of these students, I ask them, well, how much time do you think you're going to need to write this paper? Oh, I don't know. I think I can do it in about 2 hours. I know that's probably not true. 3 weeks later, they're still working on that same paper. So those are the kinds of things that often are not taught in our regular classrooms. But students who have these disabilities need some specific instruction in how to work with groups, how to participate, and how to sort of manage life. And if they don't do that, they're going to really struggle, and those are going to have long-term impacts on their future, because these are the skills that we really need as adults that we don't do a good job of teaching in schools. So I think that's something that we should really be considering. Bindiya, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the social and emotional?
Yes, but I'd like to add something to the independent work part. Sometimes if projects have long, complicated instructions, students really have trouble breaking those down. So it's overwhelming to read all the instructions, and they need help saying, okay, first you do this, next you do this, third you do that. Because for them, just looking at that text of the instructions gets overwhelming. In terms of social and emotional wellness,
overestimating or underestimating their abilities. So we also have a responsibility to help them figure out what they're able to do in, like Lindsey said, a certain amount of time over a few weeks, and what they're able to do independently and what they need support for. And so we need to teach them to be self-advocates, to ask for help when they need it, or to say, actually, I can do this.
And just, I want to add a story that had a huge impact on me. It's not really a story, but a man was talking about how if somebody sort of loses their leg and they decide that they want to climb Everest, and it takes them twice as long to climb Everest as everybody else, we throw parades for them. There are parties. It is, wow, look at this man. Like, look at what he overcame in order to climb Everest. And nobody cares about the fact that it took him just as long. They really can recognize the extra effort that it took. For some of our students with the disabilities that we're talking about, writing an essay is their Everest. And nobody ever gives them a parade or a medal or anything for having overcome the difficulties that it took for them to turn that essay in. Instead, everybody's like, why is it late? Why do you have all these grammatical mistakes? Why is your paper all crumpled up? Like, we just nitpick on those little things. And so I think just imagining that impact of growing up that way, knowing how hard you are working, and never getting, I mean, usually that hard work doesn't get you the payoff that it gets for everybody else. So, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit here to talk about something that a lot of schools aren't talking about yet or are just starting to talk about. And this is the group of kids with whom we say, you know what, they'll be just fine. That kid's smart, doesn't matter what we do in the classroom, he's going to succeed. We don't need to focus on him, we need to focus on the kids that are struggling to meet the standards, that are struggling to pass, the kids with disabilities. Now, some of the kids we're going to talk about now actually also have a disability. We call that twice exceptional, where they may be diagnosed as gifted and also have specific learning disability, or ADHD. I will say, it's interesting that the top 3 things that are used as misdiagnoses for giftedness, ADHD, ASD, the autism spectrum disorder, and also personality disorder. So it's very interesting to see diagnoses change over time as we get more information and knowledge about giftedness, and I'm going to combine that with highly able. So there are 3 premises from which I'm drawing this part of our discussion today. One is that high-level intelligence makes certain demands upon the gifted or highly able learner. 2, that those demands may result in behaviors. And 3, that there are curricular implications inherent in those demands. So when we think about the highly able or gifted, or the high flyers that we might call them, we have different strengths that we attach to them, which are true. But I want us to start looking at some of the possible issues that may come along with that. So, that was quick. So a student who acquires and retains information quickly, that sounds amazing. What could be wrong with that? Great, we want all our kids to do that. Well, they might get super impatient. If they're getting it quickly and other students are taking a while, or you're giving everyone time to grasp it, they don't want that routine of, like, we're reviewing, now we're talking about what we did last year, now we're cycling through the material again. They're like, let's get to the next thing. Don't do my white thing yet. They might be inquisitive. Who doesn't want a kid to be inquisitive? Amazing. They're looking for significance. Yes, that's what education is about. What might happen? You might not be able to answer those questions they have for you. What is the meaning of this? Why are we doing this? Why are you talking about this again? Did you know this that I researched last night that you may not know? Those are the things we don't like. Intrinsic motivation. Who doesn't like intrinsic motivation? What might be an issue? They do not want to do what you want them to do. They are not motivated by your grades. They are not motivated by your praise. They could not care less what their parents think of them. They are internally motivated by what they want to do, what they see. Enjoys problem solving, and they can use abstract reasoning. That is one of the biggest tenets that you'll see, the abstract nature. In fact, we think of the highly able or gifted as constructivist. As decontextualist instead of constructivist. What this looks like in the classroom would be, how did you get to that answer? Show me. I just know it. Whereas other students who have some of the profiles that we discussed earlier are constructivists, and they do look at scaffolds and step by step, how did I get here? And the other kids were like, show me 50 ways how you can do this problem. They're like, I know already the end of the story. Like, why am I showing you my steps? So Again, resisting the routine, the practice that you want for them. Seeks cause and effect relationships. That sounds amazing. What could that look like? If you're not clear on why you have asked them to do what you want them to do, they may resist you. These are the kids that are going to drive you crazy. This comes up a lot with parents when they talk to me about what's happening at home. And if a parent says, you know, we're going to the mosque, or we're meeting up with grandma, or we have to dress like this for this tradition, they want to know why. And why that's their belief when they haven't even had a say in it. What is tradition? Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this? So they get that resistance sometimes at home. This one is a big one. There is a big emphasis. This is one of the strongest tenets that I've seen in my practice. This emphasis on equity, on fairness. And that sounds great. That is what we teach our kids to do. We want them to be these great humans and citizens and to care about this. But what this might turn into is that they take these concerns home with them. They've watched something on YouTube. They've heard something in social studies class at very young ages. And they have no connection to that country or that concern. And they may go home and be depressed about it for months, crying about it, feeling guilty that they're not doing something about it. And I've seen this as young as age 5. And the research tells us that the gifted are at a high risk for suicide, for college dropout, for anxiety, for depression. So this is definitely an area that I think we haven't spent enough time really looking at. We're just like, oh, they'll be fine. High expectations of self and others. Take a guess. What could this be? What might be a possible issue with that, having high expectations of self and others?
Sometimes they might not be able to achieve what they set out because there are certain conditions which are not in there.
So perfectionism, right, may come up. They may be setting, you even mentioned earlier that some kids have a warped sense of their abilities. I absolutely see that with the gifted. And it typically means, although we have an impression that they might be arrogant and think they know everything, I find much more often that they are so down on themselves and they think they're the stupidest humans that ever existed. We're like, this is the brightest kid in my school. So can you click on this one? So the perfectionism, and perfectionism it comes in different forms. It doesn't just mean I work and work until I get this right. It might mean I'm not even doing this because it won't be perfect. And an interesting thing happens if you're a classroom teacher. You may have seen this if you work with a child like this. You give feedback, and it's a perfect score, or whatever your version of a perfect score is. And the child's not happy with that score. In my conversations with students, this is what I hear. They actually don't respect the teacher, because if you think I did a perfect job on this piece of crap, there's something wrong with you. That's a real thing. They know they could have done better. When I say, but you got 100% on this math quiz, there's a right and a wrong answer. No, I could have explained it better. I could have shown different steps. I could have gone to another level. What are you talking about? It's all perfect. It's a really interesting way of thinking. And it may come off to you as the teacher or the administrator who's having the conversation, or the parent. It's a good job. Stop. What are you doing? This is perfect. They're processing something completely different. And sorry, to go back for a second, it may make them intolerant of other students, intolerant of their parents, and intolerant of their teachers. This is not an arrogance per se. This is the idea that I'm expecting perfection, and if you say you're the leader, I'm expecting you to be fair, I'm expecting you to know more than I do, and I'm expecting this high level. So if anything is even perceived to be less than that, there can be a lot of conflict there. Okay, a couple more here. Creative and inventive, new ways of doing things. What could be an issue here? In the classroom, they're not following your program, right? They're creative. They're thinking of a new way to do it, a different answer, a way of thinking about it. Intense concentration. This is another one you'll see. Persistence, not in areas of your interest, in areas of their interest. And what that might look like is they may neglect things, why their room is not clean, why this homework assignment in math is not turned in because they're writing this amazing social studies essay that they're obsessed with, or they're creating a robot at home, which has nothing to do with your schoolwork. If you know a gifted adult, this is the one that doesn't return your calls for a month. Sensitivity, empathy, desire to be accepted. There is a high level of sensitivity to criticism, to what's going on with other kids. I think of a girl just at the top of my head who always is worried about gender equality and racial equality, and she will run up, Miss Churchville, I've experienced sexism today, and she's got a story. Or my friend is the victim of a counselor talking about dress code, and she's perfectly dressed, right? So she gets really obsessed and intense about these things. So this might look like sensitivity to criticism. This is the student, if you're a teacher, and you've given the feedback, and there's a few changes you'd like the student to make on the essay. They don't want to hear it. It's not even that they don't respect you in that particular scenario. For many of our gifted and highly able students, they have done what they are going to do. They have put the work in, they have researched it, they have written it. What they are turning into you is finished, and they will hand it to you, and they don't want to hear anything more about it. So that needs to be taught, understood first where they're coming from, and then taught. How do I help the child understand that feedback is a positive thing? That is a long journey, a very long journey. And we have to find that balance between making them down on themselves for the criticism and showing them this is amazing, here's one more step that you should take. And independent, definitely. The majority of HA kids, gifted kids, do not want to work in a group. So we talked about what that looks like in the classroom. We all want collaboration. Let's work in these cooperative groups. Let's pick some partners. Let's shift it all around. They're not interested in that. They always, not always, but most kids prefer to work solo, or they want to choose the people in their groups. That's something to consider. It sounds like they shouldn't have a say in that, but we have research that tells us if you mix the groups so much that students don't have intellectual peers, everybody loses, right? The kids who are struggling feel resentful that they're being coached or all the answers are being given by the stronger kid, and vice versa. They feel resentful that they're doing all the work. They don't have the patience to wait for that. So we have to think about how we balance that in classrooms. They may reject input from everybody. We talked about this before, and definitely nonconformity. And diverse interests and abilities sounds great, but a possible issue could be, that's why this is often diagnosed as ADHD, right? Or with executive functioning issues. I would say that 95% of the kids that I've worked with in my programs are terrible with executive functioning skills. They have no idea how to manage their time. So that's another skill that we teach them. Even though they don't have a disability per se, they do struggle with doing a million things at once, and they have equal interest in all of those things. So it can be difficult to prioritize. And the last one, a strong sense of humor. Sounds great before you click. Oh, well, you're going to click this, okay? This happens a lot, especially in the younger grades where the other kids are not developed enough to even have that adult sense of humor. Some of your gifted and highly able kids have a well-developed sense of humor. They're understanding Seinfeld, right? And they're trying to have conversations with 6-year-olds. And they're just looking at them like, what are you talking about? Like, the adults get it, but the peers may misunderstand their humor quite a bit. Okay? So I want to take a few minutes to think about behavior, not just for the highly able, but also to include all of our students. And those of you who are counselors or administrators or coordinators are in a very, very unique position to support your teachers in understanding and to support your parents in understanding behavior. So we're going to take a few minutes to talk about the difference between, and just stop there for a second, traditional behavior management. I want you to turn to an elbow partner and think, what do you think the difference might be between what we traditionally know as behavior management and what we're going to focus on today, which is called positive behavior support? Go. So traditional behavior management, what might be different to positive behavioral support? I'll go quickly through the behavior thing. What do we have at? Oh, this is kind of the end. Ah. Oh, and I'll hand that out and we can just have it as a reference. Yeah, love it. Yeah. I think we just make a comment about it. Like, consider with all these things you might want to consider. And finishing your sentences. Okay, and we're coming back together. Thank you. So when you think about traditional behavior management, the word is in the management, that somehow we're going to extinguish these behaviors from our children. And positive behavior support, so in behavior management, the focus is on the child. The child is the one that needs to change. This is what the expectations are, child needs to change. We're managing that behavior. In positive behavior intervention and support, you're really looking at supporting new desirable behaviors. You are not trying to extinguish the behaviors. That is impossible. Not for long term. You can scare them into it for about a week. And after that, they need to be able to make that change. So in positive behavior intervention and support, you're really talking about what are the environments that we're going to set up. In other words, what are the adults going to do differently to support these new behaviors? Let me say that again. What do the adults need to do differently to support these new desirable, pro-social behaviors? We're looking at skill deficits, not bad kid needs to change, but there's something lacking. This is one thing that I learned very early in my career that has stuck with me and really framed my narrative about behavior, that there is no bad behavior. There is just a need, an attempt to get a need met. Think about that. Whenever a child is showing a behavior that's inappropriate, that's wrong, that's bad, they're not just jerks, right? Even as adults, we're not just jerks, we're not just horrible, evil people trying to be evil in the world. When you yell at your husband, there's a need that you are attempting to get met. When he avoids doing something, there's a need, right? In everything, it happens with us. And it's very difficult to change our behaviors if we don't have some way to replace that behavior and still get our needs met. So when you're thinking about behaviors, think, what does this child need? We say a lot, I hear this all the time in my career, you guys have heard it as well, everyone in here, he's just trying to get attention. He's attention seeking. Give him some attention. That's a need that he needs to get met. He's gonna get it some way or another. He might destroy your classroom before he gets it. So think about, if you need attention, I'm gonna make sure you get it in a way that is positive. Does that make sense? You guys are looking at me like, Okay, so moving on. I'm going to take a couple seconds just so that you guys, as what we call the first responders, can help support other teachers. If you're a teacher, you can support your teachers if you're a counselor, an administrator, a coordinator, thinking about the ABCs of behavior. This is key to behavior support. Thinking about that there is always, 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 always a triggering event. Always. It might have happened before they walked into your classroom. They might have had a fight with a parent. They might have had a friend ignore them. They might have just realized they left their homework at home. Whatever that triggering event was, and then there is a behavior that follows. The tricky thing is figuring out what that triggering event was. Sometimes you see it in class, right? Sometimes you turn when they're throwing a piece of paper at someone else, and you miss the triggering event. So trying to find out what happened before, what was the behavior, and then there's always a consequence. I don't mean consequence like you gave them a consequence for their behavior. It means what happened after they exhibited that behavior. When they threw something at someone's face, did the whole class laugh? That's a consequence. That's a positive consequence. I'm going to do that again if my need is to get attention from my classmates and have them enjoy what I'm doing. If they get kicked out of class and they continue doing it, that's a positive consequence for them. I was like, ooh, perfect. I know exactly what to do to get out of class. So thinking about what's happening before, you can't always see that, but you can always see the behavior. And the key for us, what we actually can control, is what that consequence is after the behavior.
So we were actually really excited to talk to this group of people because the people in this room are often the first responders, right? Exceptional students often make teachers feel like they're making their jobs more difficult. And who hears about it? The special education teachers, the leaders of the school, the counselor, and that is who is in this room. So we want to kind of arm you with some information as first responders. We talked earlier about how we are all really well positioned to create that team to support students. But what do we do while we're creating that team? So this is what we're handing out is a tool that we have created we created it for our counselors. We use it as special educators at ASB as well. But it's really all about somebody comes saying there's a problem. First thing we need to do, we need to get students, I'm assuming we're all working in secondary level, we need to get students involved in talking about and helping us to figure out the problem, and we need to get families involved in the process. And then we need to just be really clear about what is the problem. I don't want your stories, I don't want to know what just happened today. Like, let's really try to get at the root of it, and then let's really get clear about what we want to see in the classroom, like what is the goal, and then come up with a plan to really reach it. So this is just a tool we wanted you to be able to take home with you. This is what we give our counselors for. When a teacher or a parent or somebody comes, this is kind of our first step to respond in putting together supports, whether they be social emotional or academic for students with exceptionalities. Yeah.
I just want to briefly explain the other side. This is like advanced support. So the first one is like a basic, anyone can sort of script it and use this one. On the back, once you guys have systems in place, you can start thinking, how are you tracking the goal that you've set? They have to set some kind of a goal. They might not be there. In the first one, you're just saying like, hey, let's put some things in place, let's talk through it and identify it. So just so you understand the difference between the sides.
The final thing that we really want to we want to put in your ear is just remembering that there are lots of pathways to successful adult lives. And I think as educators, that should be our goal for students, to help our students grow up to be successful and productive and happy adults. And as school systems, we tend to create very specific pathways and trajectories that we expect students to go through. When the reality is, I bet almost nobody in this room perfectly followed that path that we think everybody should be going down. And so we need to keep that in mind, and we need to be able to help, especially for our students with exceptionalities. We need to keep those in mind for our students. We need to help our parents to understand that, and we need to remind ourselves that as well. I know I've had a lot of students, for sure, post-secondary education. There is no student that we've talked to today for whom post-secondary education is not the right option, potentially. It is not the only option, but it certainly can be the right option. What might not be right, though, is the big name school or the school that your whole family has gone to. These are students that we need to help them find the right option for them, giving their very unique collection of strengths and of needs. Sometimes it means waiting for a couple of years before you go to college. Sometimes it means, I know your parents really want you to become a doctor, but you really hate biology and struggled in it, and you hate math, so how could we maybe build on your strengths as a writer to help you find a career that might make sense for you? And again, the people in this room are well situated to have those conversations with students, to have those conversations with parents, but conversations aren't enough. We also need to have plans for how we're going to help students get there.
I just want to add something that's before post-secondary, whether they're in elementary or middle, really thinking about redefining possibly, or at least defining what success means. And as Lindsey talked about, we have that idea in mind. We're a college prep school, or every child gets to this level, but really thinking, is that right for every child? When I think about elementary school kids, in what situation in life will they need to sit quietly facing a certain direction on the carpet? I don't know what we're preparing them for. That might not be within their grasp immediately. So is that the thing to focus on? Is that success for them? In middle school, are they going to have all of the same writing assignments as every other kid? Maybe not. Really thinking about what does each student need? How do we help them understand their strengths and weaknesses? How do we help parents have realistic goals without quashing their dreams? We're never going to tell a kid you can't, but we want to make sure they have options.
I think also it's really important as counselors to really know your context and what options are possible besides college, right? If you help students to be self-aware and be self-advocates so they have voice in what they want to do after school, that it's important for you to be able to provide the information of the options that are possible. Online classes, community colleges, internships, just whatever, whatever's available in your context. And it's really a responsibility for you to understand what those options are.
All right, it's on you.
Any questions?
Yeah, we want to give you a chance to ask any questions about what you've heard today, or if there are things that we haven't covered that are kind of under this umbrella that we've been discussing, we'd like to hear about those as well. Are you loud enough, or do you need a mic?
Yeah, I think I'm on.
Oh.
I have two concerns. Concern number one, we talk much about students, and other hand, we're talking to parents. So I really struggle with dealing with unruly and rowdy parents. Because whenever you talk about the child, about the behavior, sometimes they are not ready to listen. This is number one.
Wait, how many do you have on that list?
Sometimes they get terrible and horrifying. Concern number two, what is the appropriate level of identifying that gifted children and autism spectrum meter? Appropriate age level.
So, if you don't mind, I'll answer the first one, and then you guys can take the second. We've all had experiences with parents that might be challenging to work with. And I like to think of them in the same way that I think of students and difficult teachers, in the same way that we talked about behaviors. There's an attempt to get a need met. There's a fear, possibly. This is what I found the most in parents. And I'm not a parent, but I've, over the years, started to develop an empathy towards parents. It must be very difficult to worry that you are not doing your best for your child. If your child is not succeeding in school, if your child is struggling with friendships, if your child is having a hard time with their teachers or the content. So a lot of the behaviors that we see, if we can step back from like, oh, this parent is driving me crazy, to why would this parent purposely go out of his or her way to drive me crazy? There's a purpose to the behavior. So if we can see beyond that, sometimes parents just need to be heard. Like, I'm scared that my child is not going to graduate. I am scared that my child will not have friends. I am scared that the divorce I just went through has ruined my child. So if we can react to what we hear underneath, they call it the iceberg, right? What's underneath that, I think you will start to frame those behaviors in a different way. Okay, sorry, I didn't quite understand your second question about what were the parameters for differentiating between autism spectrum disorder and giftedness? Oh, when should you diagnose? For ASD or for giftedness? Or both? Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in the literature. At the American School of Bombay, we look at a hard sort of identification from grade 3 and up. However, I consult with teachers from pre-K up because you see those signs very early. But what happens is you don't want to put a hard diagnosis because often after a year or two, their peers have caught up. So you really want to give it time for brains to develop and to see what's happening. But sometimes there are kids that we see all these behaviors that are stopping them from performing, and sometimes it's appropriate to actually do a psychological assessment, and we find their IQs. One kid in kindergarten has an IQ of 140. Like, obviously we need to do something different. He's at grade level in his academics, but his behaviors show us that we need to intervene early, so it was appropriate to diagnose that particular student.
Yeah, and for ASD, particularly in boys, it is often diagnosed very young, very early. But I think that in schools we should be looking for it. But especially in girls, they are actually developing, I think, new diagnostic criteria for ASD in girls because we recognize that it is not something that we don't have a lot of boys with autism because autism is something that's special to boys. We are just missing it a lot in girls because it looks different in them. So I think in schools you should always be looking for it. And if you're concerned, though, it is difficult to diagnose sometimes, especially if you're not catching it until they're already in the school setting, that then you need to refer them to professionals who are experts in diagnosing ASD. But it tends to be something that is diagnosed young, around 3. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
We are talking about inclusive education.
Mm-hmm.
And in a heterogeneous group of 40, working upon one child is quite good. But the problem lies there when we need to convince another 39 to accept the child. That's the challenge for the school educators and special educators or the school the parents complain, the persistent parents complain about this child, it becomes a vexing element for all of us not to handle it precisely. So we have some suggestions to, allow those 39 to accept that's one, which has become a bone of contention between the parents and the school.
Yeah. So in my personal experience, it's often not the kids who have an issue accepting the student who's different, as long as the teacher in the room is kind of the leader and we are all a part of this community. I think kids get on with that, especially younger kids, very quickly. I do think that is often the adults that we need to convince to come along the way. There is research to suggest that inclusion, first of all, not that those parents might care, but it does lead to the best outcomes for students with disabilities. But there is also research that inclusion does not negatively impact the non-disabled peers, and that the non-disabled peers do just as well as they would have, or sometimes even better. And the students who often do better in inclusive setting are those students, maybe not the top students, but the students who do not have an identified disability, but might be struggling a little bit academically. And because the teacher needs to break down and scaffold and do some things that the students with disabilities need, those students who maybe have average academic skills, they are actually learning from that kind of breakdown that the teacher has to do in order to ensure progress for students with disabilities. But there is no research that has ever found that having students in inclusive classrooms hurts the students who do not have disabilities. But of course, we also need to ensure everybody that that our teachers have the training to educate inclusively, and that we are making sure that we are providing the supports in that classroom to make sure that every single student can learn, and that the teacher isn't just spending all of their time with one while the 39 are just kind of left to learn on their own. I don't know if you guys.
Can I answer this?
Oh, sure, yeah.
The school leaders, I have every classroom has more than 3 students with learning challenges, and quite a few we do have autism spectrum. But I think at a policy level, if management and everybody take it that we are a school which is willing to spend our time in helping and working with the children, it helps a lot, because it becomes a training session every year and a counseling session continuously with teachers. But along with students, especially I've seen with children with autism, the whole group accepts children very fast, and they're willing to spend time with their friends. Whenever there is a routine change, their buddies are the ones who are kind of help them. You know what, this is going to happen today, and this is how we have to do. And I've continuously seen the kids are more supportive, more engaging in terms of packing their school bags, to organizing their stationery, to many things. And whenever we have the children who have challenges, we have a first day over a week, a circle time with the children. And it helps quite a bit for children accepting everybody is different, but we're all same, working in the same group. And engaging them in group activities is like, because here I've seen their own friends become the strength and backbone for these children.
Thank you so much.
Splendidly for last 10 years.
10 years.
And a lot.
Connect
And-
after.
And I have children who do the students orientation. We have parent orientation every year. Starting with my daughter, who starts orientation saying, "Hey parents, I'm dyslexic and I'm A star in the IGCSE English."
Nice.
So that kind of starts off saying that we are high potential and we can do really well. All we need is acceptance.
Awesome, thank you. You had a question? Any last? I'll make sure I get anybody else. One? Anyone else? Okay, so we'll end with your question. It better be a good one.
I can't guarantee that. But I'm a lecturer in a university in Scotland. I'm a psychologist as well. And I'm interested in the transition from school to higher education. You're absolutely right. There's lots of different pathways. It's not the only pathway. This is one of the dilemmas I think we face. Is that when I was a student 30 years ago, we sat in lectures and we were given information. We had to essentially store it and use it. But now the whole emphasis in higher education is a much more dynamic approach. And this is actually where student social skills become so much more important than they ever were in the old days. And this is, I think, the big dilemma. We have constant emphasis upon group work, upon giving presentations, developing those transferable skills that are actually much more important than content that you'll forget in 6 months. And this really means that the social skill dimension that students bring are actually probably more important than their academic skills. So I just wondered, in terms of strategies that we can develop in students to manage the social skills that they will need in a higher education setting. Because unless they have those social skills, they may have the academic skills, they are in a sense set up to fail. Because the whole curriculum now is so focused on these transferable skills that have their basis in strong social skills.
So I know in many schools, certainly in ours, and if you haven't heard the hot buzzwords of SEE or SEL, get on it, right? Because social emotional learning is huge. And you may have what we call approaches to learning or habits of mind that schools are starting very early to work with students on to address a lot of these questions that you have. And thinking about how do kids work well in groups? How do kids get rid of the anxiety to stand in front of a room? Now, in talking about the disabilities that we covered today and in talking about highly able and gifted education, we do have to think about at what level can we really expect some of those skills to come out. And we have to think about what accommodations are important for them. And now, I don't know about in Scotland, where your university is, but in the States, for example, many schools have accommodation, disability departments where they actually will work with students on the plans that they have to make sure they get the accommodations they need in choosing courses, in the time it takes for them to complete assignments, et cetera. I'll let Lindsey answer.
I think the other thing is those of us who are working in secondary or even primary settings, because group work and collaboration and social skills might be difficult for some of these students with exceptionalities, that doesn't mean that they're off the hook on them. It just means that whereas everybody else might develop them on their own, they'll just figure it out. The students that I work with might not. And so it is also on me to explicitly be teaching those skills, to be scaffolding that group work and that collaborative work so that when they do get to their next environment in which there is a good chance that they will need to collaborate, they'll have had an opportunity to have developed those skills. I think that also gets to, though, that importance of understanding that there are multiple pathways. Because, I think about a young man that I work with who has autism, and he would not thrive in your setting. Like, he would not thrive in a place where he needs to stand up and give presentations and work collaboratively all the time. And so I'm not going to recommend to him or to his family that that's the kind of setting that he goes to. Post-secondary education is definitely possible for him, but maybe online education is going to be what's better, because he's probably not going to have a job in the future that is highly collaborative either, because that is just not his strength. So I think when I come at it from a secondary perspective of we need to teach those skills and we have to help people find the right path. I think in post-secondary settings, though, you can learn from some of what we do by setting up some scaffolding to support that group. Things as simple as having identified jobs within the group. Just things to help support. It's not just, okay, create groups and go figure it out yourselves, but here are some tools I'm going to give your groups in order to help you manage it, can help those students who maybe haven't quite developed the skills.
Sorry, we've kind of run out of time. We'll chat with you after. Thank you all so much for your